Mr. Finkelstein, how has Israel's mishandling of the 2006 Lebanon War affected opinion of Israel, particularly in America, but internationally as well?
Well, that's actually one of the interesting examples of how public opinion has shifted in the United States. If you look at the public opinion polls after the July-August 2006 war in Lebanon, what Israelis call the Second Lebanon War. It's actually about the Fifth Lebanon War. They invaded Lebanon in 1978. They invaded Lebanon in 1982. They invaded Lebanon in 1993. They invaded Lebanon in 1996. And then in 2006, in 1982, they killed between 18 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. So it's obviously not the second war. 1993, some of you will remember, is Operation Accountability by Rabin. 1996 was Operation Grapes of Wrath by Perez, the so-called Nobel laureate for peace. So it's a very ugly record. But what was remarkable was the poll results after the 2006 war. As most of you will remember, the newspaper coverage was overwhelmingly favorable to Israel during the war. And yet the polls showed that more than half, around 52% of Americans, according to the Zogby poll, held both sides equally responsible for the war. And that was, as I said, in light of what was the news coverage. It was a quite remarkable finding and demonstrating, I think, that public opinion is changing and also that people are having access to alternative forms of information and are no longer so reliant on the mainstream media. It should be borne in mind, however, that what happened in Lebanon was so ugly that had Americans known the real picture, the unfiltered picture, I suspect the poll results would be very different. Let's just take one example, the question of the cluster bombs. According to Human Rights Watch, Hezbollah probably fired about 3,000 cluster bombs at Israel. But many of you, I think, will be surprised to learn that Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster bomblets on southern Lebanon. It was the densest use of cluster bombs in the history of the world, the densest. The United States used about 10 million during the first Iraq War, but over a much wider area. This was the most dense use, and what was most shocking and most criminal was these cluster bombs were 90% were used in the last 72 hours of the war, when the UN resolution had already been passed ending the war, and they were just waiting for its implementation. For those of you who don't know about cluster bomb technology, the cluster bombs are very inefficient, and they turn into landmines because they don't explode on impact. About half of them don't explode. I think in the case of the Israelis, it was 30% didn't explode. And so there are all the after effects now because the fields in southern Lebanon were saturated with the cluster bomblets, and people right as we speak now are being injured and killed as they try to harvest their crops.
With all of the social injustices of the world, what has prompted you to concentrate on Israel? And would you address, some may refer to you as a self-hating Jew. Would you address why you may feel that is true or not true?
Well, the question of why I focus on this topic, as it happens by serendipity, Cleveland is also the residence of my college roommate, Dr. Tannenbaum, who's sitting over here. And I think he could testify that when I was in college, I was very much a political person of the left or radical, but that Israel was not at all on my radar screen. My main focus and interest at the time was the war in Vietnam. Domestically, it was the civil rights movement, as well as, in particular, in college, it was the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez, organizing efforts. Israel came relatively late in my life, the Israel-Palestine conflict came relatively late in my life. It came, I can date it precisely, it came in June 1982 when I joined those who were opposing the Israeli invasion of Lebanon of that month through September, culminating, as many of you remember, in the Sabra and Shatila massacres. I had joined a Jewish group called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon, and at that point there was a lot of discussion in the group about this thing that was called Zionism, a topic about which I knew exactly zero. I began then to read on the topic because I like my politics to be intellectually informed, and it so happened I was a graduate student at Princeton, and I was one of those proverbial ABDs, all but dissertation. I couldn't figure out a dissertation topic. After reading about Zionism for a couple of years, trying to figure out what it's all about, I then decided to turn it into my dissertation topic, and it turned into the result, the dissertation I wrote. So now I had a political interest in the topic because of the Israeli invasion. I also had an intellectual and professional interest in the topic because of my doctoral dissertation. And of course I am Jewish, and my parents are passed through the Nazi Holocaust. And the Nazi Holocaust was constantly being used as a justification for what Israel was doing. So I had the third interest was the personal interest, namely my family background. So all three, as it were, rivers converged, and had Israel behaved in a civil fashion, ended the occupation, I'm quite sure I've been on to something else in the world, because there, as you quite accurately say, there are many crimes and misdemeanors being committed in the world, and had this one been resolved as it ought to have been resolved a long time ago, I'm sure, had I been invited here, I'd be lecturing on another topic. Now, you now asked one other question, namely the question of, would I like to comment on the question of whether I am a self-hating Jew? But you know, it's a reasonable question. People have the right to ask it. It does seem to me, though, to be totally irrelevant, and allow me to explain why. As you probably know, during the Nazi era, the Nazis liked to refer to Jewish physics, namely Einstein. And they like to refer to Jewish psychoanalysis, namely Freud, because Freud and his whole school were Jewish, overwhelmingly. Now, a rational person, it seems to me, doesn't care about the background of the person. Physics doesn't become true or false based on whether or not the main physicists are Jewish. And psychoanalysis doesn't become true or false based on the background of the main psychoanalysts who happen to be Jewish. Whether it's true or not, it's independent of, as it were, the intellectual messenger. For a rational person, the only thing that counts is the message. So my answer to you is, for argument's sake, let's agree with the insinuation that I'm a self-hating Jew. Let's agree with it. How does that change the facts? Isn't it, for a rational person, shouldn't the only issue be whether what I'm saying is true or false? I don't see how my background figures at all in this particular issue, any more than Einstein's Jewish heritage figured in whether or not E equals mc squared. Let's take the reverse. Let's say I were not a self-hating Jew. Let's say I was, in your terminology, a self-loving Jew. Let's say I was self-loving. Does that mean everything I say true? If self-hating makes everything you say false, then self-loving should make everything you say true.